Right, I'm just checking this. Good. Right, hello everybody. I have just been told by Chris what we can do is you can basically talk to me, but in order for us to record the session, you need to have your video screen off. And if you actually want to say something, it's probably better if you just basically raise your hand and we do a chat. Is that actually clear? I mean, you can actually put your microphone on if you want. As a matter of fact, I very much would like to do that because it's actually otherwise very hard for us to have any sort of interactive session at all. And I think one of the challenges being not in a lecture theatre is essentially I can't really gauge how people feel and how they react and how they respond to the delivery. So one good thing would actually be if you actually have any question at all, as we actually go along, it would be really, really good if you can actually basically, raise your hand virtually, switch your microphone on and actually say something. Because otherwise, we are just going to actually flounder around me going either too fast or too slow and not actually knowing what the reaction of the audience is. This is kind of interesting because essentially this is a new one for all of us. And so I think over the next few sessions, we are slowly going to get used to that in these new times. I'm already losing my voice. Hopefully that's not COVID. And of course we have, issues to contend like dogs barking, people, having lawnmowers, children, screaming in the pool and so forth. But I mean, that's life. Life goes on. So what I'd like you to do is, if somebody can speak up, so we just get some sort of sense whether the level, the sound level is good enough or whether we should actually crank it up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Good, very good.
Sounding good on my end.
Very good. I mean, look at this, guys. Whoops. I mean, this is a microphone and a half, isn't it? We could do a karaoke session.
Good here. I can hear you okay.
Okay, very good. So what we have to do for legal reasons, which is of course completely moronic, I didn't say that, is that as long as you don't actually have your screen video on, we can record it. If you have your screen video on, apparently not, because it's a privacy issue, but let's just take it like that. Shane, are you still having something to say because you have your hand raised? Okay, good. It's all gone.
I was wondering if that was permanently raised or not.
Yeah, I don't know actually how all of that works still, but we will actually get there. Right, let me put this on the side here. And we go up. Right, so the reason I basically, I had to go straight onto Zoom. Oh my God, what the hell is this? Dropbox. Okay, let's get out. Here we go. The reason we had to go straight onto a Zoom meeting today was that at about lunchtime, I was actually listening to the news, and the Queensland government said you can really only leave the house if you have a valid reason for work which you can't do at home. And of course, since we all work for a government institution, I can't actually fall foul of the law. And hence you basically, do this over Zoom. And it's actually something we have to get used to over time at any rate. What I also try to do is, because sometimes the Zoom recordings can be at a lower quality than if you actually do a specialized recording in a video shoot. I'm going to actually get some video feedback from you guys, how you actually feel about it. And then we can decide whether we need a second set of basically recordings to complement what we have at the moment. Right, so let's get started. The important point is, if you have anything basically which you are not clear enough, if I'm going too fast, if I'm going too slow, just raise your hand or switch your microphone on and say, hey, Thomas, I'm not quite clear about that, or can you repeat that? Because this is the real challenge when you do those kind of video conferencing without video. You do not actually know, and I cannot read your faces. So it's a very difficult conversation. So, you basically don't have to share your images. So I can't actually see, what it actually looks like in your house. You can actually see all my artwork now. But essentially, it's very important that we try to make this as interactive as possible. Are we all clear on that? Let's somebody say something.
Yep. Sounds good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Right, excellent.
Yeah.
So let me erase the screen here. Boom. So if you actually look down this very nice valley here, with, I have to do this, with vineyards here. Can everybody see the mouse? Boom, boom, going around?
Yes.
This does now as vineyards.
Yes.
Anybody got an idea where that is? Any guess?
Switzerland.
Nah.
South New Zealand.
Close. It's at the same latitude as New Zealand, but it is not New Zealand.
I can't get the.
South Africa.
No, it's not South Africa. South Africa is a
South
little bit up in the
America.
world.
Chile.
Has he?
or
No, it's not Chile.
Argentina.
It could be
Argentina.
Chile. It's. I give you a hint. When Australia hosted the Sydney Olympics, they drew a map of Australia, and they left one bit off, which
Tasmania.
Has he? Yeah.
Yeah, it's Tasmania. So it's the east coast of Tasmania, and this vineyard here, actually produces Australia's most expensive Pinot Noir. It's about $600 a bottle. But if you basically go around the corner here, you can actually buy what I actually reckon the world's best oysters, and they cost about $6 a dozen. I kid you not. And the problem is, when you go with a biologist on a holiday, you probably sit somewhere up here and eat the oysters. Your family is always greatly annoyed because I looked down that shore and I thought, whoa, look at this. Because the first thing you actually notice here on that particular shore is, you got like blue water, you got a little bit of brown stuff, got a bit of green stuff, got a bit of black stuff, and then it's all light and gray. And it actually occurs in very, very distinct sharp bends. To have a closer look here, you rush down and take a camera, you actually get a remarkable, what we call, ecological succession, which all takes place over about, basically, sorry, somebody's calling in. Yes? Hello? That's my Land Rover guy calling. So essentially, it's all taking place over 1.5 meters, and it's a really, really zonation of very, very sharp boundaries, as you can see here. Now, that's sort of the background, that we can actually go to a rocky shore and see these remarkable sharp boundaries in species distributions. And since we're online now, I have to actually get a little bit more organized. So those are the 8 basic principles which we're actually going to, explore today. And the reason I basically said in the lecture outline or in the course outline, Rocky Shores as the cradles of ecology, is that many of those concepts here about competition, about habitat complexity, about predation, about the concept of keystone species, they literally come from rocky shore ecology. And other parts of ecology have basically just adapted them. So basically, let's sort of, jump straight into the first one, which is zonation. So here is a picture from the top of Mount Kenya, which is, of course, the highest mountain in Africa. And if you actually, look at this vegetation here, it is remarkably different to the vegetation you find down on the African savanna. As a matter of fact, our understanding in ecology about how biological communities are structured in space, in particular bands, comes from basically botanists looking up mountainsides, in particular in the autumn, then they actually wondered, why do we get that sharp banding of colors? And that sharp banding of colors is, of course, in terrestrial ecology.
Something for this afternoon.
Who is talking in the background there? is actually played out over hundreds of meters or kilometers or thousands of meters up and down a mountainside. On a rocky shore, you don't actually have to travel very fast. You actually get that kind of zonation in the space of meters. Now, of course, you guys got a really raw deal this semester because you didn't get to go to Fraser Island. I can show you a picture, what it actually looks like. So, most people go to Fraser Island and they, of course, get very, very, smitten by the sandy beach. Those are the 4x4s of the university. And we usually went up, a rocky, headland here, which is called Indian Heads. But as you actually walk down, you actually get that kind of stuff. Ooh, there's a nice yacht in the background. And you might say, well, there's a few, barnacles here, growing on a rock. But if you actually look closer, you see those kind of things. The barnacles, they occur in very, very sharp horizontal strips. As a matter of fact, if you actually think about it, this is really quite unusual. You might think, ooh, what actually happened here? Did some, crazy animals come along and basically, eat all the barnacles off? Or
Not working.
go, you like that? You go a little bit lower down and you see all these algae, but the algae stop very suddenly as well. And they stop at the bottom, and then you get skirts and all sorts of stuff. Yet in other parts of that rocky shore, you basically, and remember that.
Yeah.
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 Can I ask you guys something? It becomes very hard. If you basically don't have a question to ask, and by all means say something, can you please basically mute your microphone while you're not speaking? Because otherwise we have 35 different people, talking on top of each other. So here we are, and that's a close-up of that particular rocky shore on Fraser Island. And look at those barnacles. They're literally sitting without any space in between. And this is actually key to understanding rocky shore ecology. And yet, they are limited, it appears, in their distribution in a very sharp boundary. But you also see small little guys hanging out here, whereas all the grown-ups are a little bit further down. Now, that kind of zonation or banding is a real universal feature of rocky shores the world over. I'm not going to basically force you to remember all the different zones and the particular animals which are indicative or characteristic of one. However, it is worthwhile noting that it literally occurs on every singular rocky shore the world over. And here we come back to our Tasmanian example. So it really is a global feature. And while we might say, okay, the bands are of a different color, they have a different morphology, some of them are rougher, some of them are smoother, the true differences are really differences in species composition. So each of those bands has a slightly different species makeup compared to the next one. Now, this looks like a very, very horrible scheme. Don't worry too much about it. It basically, comes from probably a few thousand rocky shore ecologists over the space of, 4 decades, having actually worked it all out. Basically speaking, we have 3 broad zones. The first one up here is called the supralittoral zone, which basically means above the rocky shore. The one in the middle is called the middle one, the mid-littoral one, and the other one is called the infralittoral zone. Remember when we talked about spring tides and neap tides in lecture number 2? The highest tides occur at the transition between spring and summer, and the transition between autumn and winter. Those are called the equinoxes. And basically, that's basically when you get the highest spring tides and the lowest low water levels. And roughly speaking, they set apart. I should really have another projection at the back here so I can actually point out this is my fishing rod. Or I got a bowstring here. You could actually use that. Basically, I'm not going to play the violin because I just started it. That was my project for being in lockdown. But maybe by the end of the semester we can actually have a little bit of a musical interlude. Anybody else playing an instrument? No?
I got a piano.
Right? That would actually work. That could actually be quite cool, Anyways, so the topmost zone, and you are allowed to go outside for exercise. And if you really, want to go for a walk on the beach, you can observe each of those particular zones on each of the rocky shores along the coast here. So the topmost zone is called the splash zone or the supralittoral zone. And basically the only measurable source of water here is coming from waves splashing up. And there's 3 different forms of organisms which are typical of it. The first one is blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. The other one is periwinkles. And, basically right at the bottom here, you might get some barnacles. So what are blue-green algae? Well, periwinkles, those are the species you actually get on our shores here. Don't worry too much about the names. You might have come across a few of them in Andrew's course on North Strait Island, but basically they're about that size. They're about a centimeter at most, and they're small little snails clinging to the rocks. Now, what do they eat? They eat that kind of black stuff. You might have experienced when you go on a rocky shore after rain, you think you're going on the upper shore where it's nice and dry, but it can be quite devilishly slippery. And the rock becomes slippery because the blue-green algae, which actually form a really, really dense thin film over the rock, they soak up moisture and essentially they swell and become kind of slimy. And the periwinkles actually graze that off. The second one, the mid-littoral zone, I'm going through those quite quickly, is basically the suite of barnacles. They are complemented by things like mussels. You can actually pry some oysters off, a few other snails, crustaceans, and so forth. But it really is all about barnacles. And the lower one is very, very easily found. It's basically where the algae don't come up further from the sublittoral zone. Now, as I said, barnacles are the characteristic taxon the world over. And, people, when they talk about Charles Darwin, people usually remember the finches, and they remember on the Galapagos Islands, and they remember, the small little boat he went on, which is the beagle. But what most people don't actually realize is Darwin wrote the most comprehensive study ever on barnacles. And it took him 8 years to basically write that. And it is still the most basically complete reference work on this kind of group of crustaceans. So believe it or not, Charles Darwin was in his second career, so to speak, an evolutionary ecologist, but first and foremost, he was a barnacle man. That sounds a bit odd, but never mind. He wrote about barnacles. So here we go. There's lots of websites. Here's the man. And most people think, oh, he's the father of evolution, which he is, evolutionary theory, I should say. So I don't get into hot, basically contested religious water. And here is barnacles. Now, barnacle is kind of an odd little animal. Normally in the lecture now, I would actually go in front of the lectern and lie on my back and wiggle my feet in the air, because I do that because a barnacle is essentially a shrimp, which basically is glued with its back to the rock, and it actually stretches its legs. Can everybody see the mouse pointer? Stretches the legs out, through an opening, and essentially it is a shrimp glued to the rock, right, on its back and having the legs out in the air. And it stretches its legs out to filter plankton out of the water. Now, when you actually eat a prawn or a shrimp, you actually take the outer shell off. Now, that outer shell is basically transformed in barnacles in a number of very hard calcified plates, but it's the same thing. So it's essentially an extremely well-protected shrimp glued on its back to a rock with the feet sticking out, which is kind of cool. Here we go, barnacles again. Now, there's different types of barnacles. Some of them are like that form here, which is the one most people are familiar with. It can be, half a centimeter to a centimeter high, 2 centimeters across. Here we see the basically legs sticking out. Some of them are actually, however, are on a stalk. And if you ever go to Spain, the Atlantic coast of Spain or the southern coast of Chile, make sure you actually eat some of those stalked barnacles. They are arguably the most delicious seafood. And you often actually get them when you actually go along the beach and you pick up a piece of driftwood. There's all those little goose barnacles or stalked barnacles sitting on it. Now, there is one other thing about barnacles which I have to mention here because it always raises a significant laugh. And you can actually see it in this one here. Everybody can see that structure here. Now, barnacles are basically stuck to the rock for life, literally. The larvae, this is the larvae of a barnacle, they swim in, and they basically, glue themselves to the rock like this one. But once you have made your decision of where you live, you can't actually move at all anymore. Which basically means when it comes to, let's say, Friday night or Saturday night, and you kind of feel the urge to be a little bit amorous, it becomes really hard to go on a date. Which basically then means barnacles have an extremely long copulatory organ. As a matter of fact, arguments are that they have the longest penis of all animals because they have to take it out and literally, go around the neighborhood. And unfortunately, for some of the most, adventurous, barnacle males, that goes to an extent that they basically overstretch it, and essentially it becomes necrotic and they die. Here you go. We're all happy, not to be barnacle sometimes. Now, the other things we actually get, we get gastropods, which actually have adapted to high wave energy by being extremely flat and having their shells broken up into blades. Those are called chitons. They can be, of a reasonable size. And then we got all sort of gastropods. This is really the zone where you get, dozens and dozens of snail species the world over. You get those guys here, the mulberry whelks. They actually go around and drill holes into barnacles and basically suck the inside out. And you can always tell, this is a trivial pursuit question, how do you tell the difference between a grazing, a herbivorous snail and a predatory one? Well, the predatory snails, they got this little canal here. Yes, the kids are crying in the swimming pool, just a couple moments. Modern education. And essentially, that is, the basically the tongue of the snail is transformed into a drilling organ, and that actually, drills through the shell and then actually sucks the inside out, just like a spider. Now, the infraliteral zone is the one which some people have argued is not really true part of a rocky shore, but rather is just an extension of the subtidal into the intertidal. So quite often we get things like sea urchins, asteroids, barnacles are a lot rarer, and we get those, annoying botanical things called seaweeds, ascidians, sponges, and so forth. So, that kind of stuff. And you also get, kind of nicer looking things like, anemones, and we get starfish, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, holoturidae, and so forth. So you might say, right, I know now, I know, the animals occur in very distinct bands, but why is that so? I.e., what actually sets those species boundaries? Now, oops. Oh, that comes in part 2. I have to switch into part 2. Here we go. Ba-bum. Now, what actually sets those species boundaries are quite a number of reasonably intricate processes. And studying those intricate processes of species boundaries in the intertidal have basically led to a much closer understanding of what we take as pretty much granted competition predation effects in ecology more widely. Now, the first thing people tried to figure out, they basically said, okay, what sets the upper distributional boundaries? Ooh, I can move myself. Should we go here? Right, here we go. And essentially, what we actually did find is people said, okay, it must have something to do with the environment. Either it's too hot, it's too dry, there's too much sunlight, or whatever. So this is a particularly devious experiment. And what you can actually do is you take snails from the upper shore, you take snails from the lower shore, and then essentially you heat them up. And then, you put a little probe into it, and once this flesh basically starts to disintegrate, we actually call it the cell thermostability. But essentially, what it actually shows you is that snails on the upper shore can take a lot more heat than those from the lower shores on a tropical shore. Of course, on a cold shore, it will actually be quite the opposite. Now, why do I show you this guy here, this horrible photograph? For 2 reasons. I always remind myself is that, as you become, slightly older than 37, as an ecologist, you always have to be on guard and never to look like that. But he was actually one of the most, famous, marine biologists until a few years ago in Australia, called Tony Underwood. And his lab was called the Underworld, and everybody who basically survived it basically survived the Underworld. But he was basically a young graduate student in England in about the 70s, and it was a crazy theory about. And I just actually throw this in as a little bit of a historic anecdote. People basically said is, well, what you get up and down a rocky shore is this things called critical tidal levels. In other words, the tides do not actually rise smoothly, and they do not actually go down smoothly. The water cover period shows kinks, so to speak. And basically, and people say, well, the hypothesis is quite simple. Really, those kinks in the species, in the tidal curve, set the species boundaries, and that gives actually rise to the boundaries as we actually observe them. Now, seems logically, but actually nobody has actually measured it. So Tony Underwood went along and he measured it, and maybe that actually set his very, very interesting, critical approach to marine biology, because he always said, like, never believe anything what you read in the textbook, ever, unless it's written by me, okay? But just go out and actually measure it. And he measured it, and there wasn't any of that. Kind of interesting, and always keep that in mind, because I had many students coming to me over the years, and they basically said, "Ooh, I like to actually study that, but surely it has been done." I said, "Well, go and find out. There's only one way in science, and that actually is to actually measure things." Here's another guy called George Brunch, but he's a much nicer guy. If you ever, want to buy yourself, a book and you get it, cheaply secondhand, buy yourself this one. It's really, really good. Never mind about the Southern African one. It's really a treasure trove of general biological, wisdom as it applies to shore ecosystems. And some of the ideas can be so simple, and basically you can actually, George Branch installed a little bit of a, garden watering can, which seeped water down on different parts of the shore, and lo and behold, the barnacles and the algae starting to grow up. So we thought, well, obviously this desiccation stress has something to do with the upper boundary of those organisms. Very similar, you can actually do that, with shading organisms, or you actually expose them to more ultraviolet light or whatever. So essentially, by manipulating, by doing experiments, you can identify very, very nicely the upper boundary of those kind of organisms. People then say, well, what about starvation? What about food limitation? What about larval settlement? What about limpets? I showed you those, on sitting on a hand, basically being grazed down by algae being grazed down by limpets, or maybe there's even competition between algae. So all of those are basically biological factors. So yes, there was a good argument for physical factors setting the upper limits, but what about biological factors at the bottom? So essentially then, if you do a first year ecology lecture, there's always at least 2 hours being spent on biological interactions. And people tell you about competition, they tell you about predation, they tell you about grazing, and those are the main forms of biological interactions. This is, of course, easy. Predation is basically where somebody comes along and eats somebody else. So basically, the predator or a carnivore, is kind of bloodthirsty and eats some unsuspecting prey. Competition is a little bit more tricky, because it is essentially that two different individuals or species try to get access to a resource which is, and this is the key here, in limited supply. Now, grazing is, of course, just a special case of predation, and this is basically being a vegetarian or a vegan instead of a predator. So here is Alfred Lord Tennyson, one of the most famous poets, in the late 19th century, and he wrote something about which has been more or less mimicked or used by ecologists the world over. And some of the words are to the effect that nature read in tooth and claw. And somehow that concept that ecology is all about carnivores, predators, sharks, lions, whatever, eating antelopes and seals has literally stuck big in our brains and has dominated the, I should say, the thinking of many ecologists. So competition is quite funny, because maybe not so much now in the age of a worldwide corona pandemic, but usually economists are all about competition. But if you come to think about what does it really mean, Sometimes competition is very, very odd. I mean, look at the New Zealanders. And it's kind of funny, not much has changed really. It's really hard to actually get New Zealand jokes across if I don't have a live audience, but here we go. And of course, the New Zealanders, they have a very, very famous propensity in their rugby team. Look how bad that one is, because essentially their rugby team has dominated competitions forever, and essentially they always seem to fall, well, often fall a little bit short of expectations when it comes to the big ones. Here we go. Now, you might say, if we define competition formally as something being in limited supply, what is it on rocky shores? There seems to be enough water, there is algae coming in, there's algae growing, all of those vegetable matters are a good food source. But what really is something which cannot be made more of is space to grow on. And we call this the primary space. And why is that important? Remember that image I showed you about the barnacles. Many of the animals on a rocky shore are sessile. So what they actually do is they are permanent space preemption organisms. Once they actually sit there, other ones can't actually grow. Quite often they occur at high population densities, which is a good indication already that, of course, there is many organisms competing for the same resource. There is always a large number of larvae which try to come in from the ocean to settle. And we have something very, very important, and that is basically the resource rock can only be renewed if somebody dies or you kill somebody. And it's a pretty, interesting scenario. If you would actually write, a very bloodthirsty stage play, and if you were Shakespeare, the second, you probably would go along that kind of plot. It's pretty cool. Now, this is actually quite disturbing. I, Googled Scotland and rock. Nothing came up with barnacles because we're going to talk about an experiment from Scotland. And what actually comes up is this guy. I mean, seriously, apparently you can do Scottish yoga now. Don't ask me why, but it's a thing. You get hot yoga and you get Scottish cold yoga. Here we go. Now, why do I show you that? For the one reason, one of the most famous experiments, which occurred over the space of 2 or 3 years, involved 2 different animals. Very simple, you might say. The one called the little grey barnacles, and the other one the rock one. Never mind about the specific names. Little grey will do, and rock barnacle will do. And we basically have to go from the left here over to the right. Now, what occurs in terms of the larval settlement is that the larvae of the little grey one settle from way up the top of the shore to about the mean tidal level. And the other ones, the bigger ones, actually go all the way, from the bottom up. So you might actually say, there's actually a huge zone of overlap, but there isn't. Because what actually happens is, remember when I showed you, that very simple experiment where somebody went with a watering can and everything grew up? Essentially, the top of the shore is an extreme environment. It's basically the terrestrial environment coming down. And we are dealing with marine organisms. So they actually have to literally eke out an existence at the margin of their existence. So essentially, you have to be able to withstand UV light. You have to be able to withstand either high or very low temperatures, and either no water or rainwater, which can also be terrible for you. And it just turns out to be the case that the little guys here, the ectonomous ones, are tougher than the big ones. So we actually start to eliminate from about 1 meter off the shore what actually looks like the bigger competitor. but they're not as tough when it actually comes to withstanding physical extremes. What actually then happens, basically is the adult distribution shows that the little ones don't actually go all the way down. And you might say, why is that? We get this very, very sharp boundary, which I showed you right in the beginning between the two different species. Because as the rock barnacles grow bigger, they literally grow underneath the little ones and pry them off the rock. It's almost like when you try to get a nail out of a plank, you essentially, I should show you my boat. I restored a wooden boat, so I know a lot about that. Copper nails, try and pry it out, and you have to save every copper nails because they are, very hard to get nowadays. And essentially, those basically pry the small ones off the rock, which is of course a biological interaction. So what you basically have here is a great example of a physical limiting factor and a biological interaction leading to a clear bending. I mean, it can't actually get any better in terms of pure ecology, and you will actually find this in just about every ecology textbook. Now, we like to think in an ideal world, everybody is created equal, all animals love each other, and it's just like a nice kind of communist, style, basically regime. That's actually not true. Basically, if in these times of going into lockdown, I think we will go into lockdown very quickly, very soon, I should say. And you're looking for a book, either online or you buy one, read it online, it's not going to get delivered. Read Animal Farm. Animal Farm is absolutely fantastic because it actually starts off with the line, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. I'm not going to make any sort of jokes now about politicians in Canberra and so forth, but I think you can actually surmise, I guess, what am I aiming for. And what do we actually mean here in terms of not all animals are equal when it comes to competition? Well, that actually gives some great joy. Sporting coats have, of course, all gone into hibernation, but we're kind of obsessed with competitions. We watch basketball, we watch skiing, we watch ice hockey, we watch NIL, we watch rugby, we watch cricket, and every single sport, from badminton to curling to rugby, has a table of rankings, and essentially they, teams move up and down, but they basically, it's kind of really terrible because Australia is number 8 now, but never mind, they essentially give us an index, I should say, of the relative competitive abilities. So all things being equal, you could actually say those teams at the top of the table here are better than the teams at the bottom. And I think there's about 112 teams in the world. I think one of the last ones is the Vatican City. They have a rugby team. Never mind. So essentially, we know from our own society, and we kind of encourage that, competitive abilities. We're not actually very nice to each other, that essentially not every team, not every member of society, and so not every species in ecology has the same competitive abilities. It's a nice dream, and I think that was one of the founding premises of communism, but it just didn't work. So how does this actually work on a rocky shore? What's the significance here? The significance is quite a simple one. And that is basically, you can actually work out by a series of experiments, basically, who survives when you actually pair them, almost like a little gladiator arena. It's literally done like that. You basically, remove certain species, see how the other ones go, blah, 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 blah. And you actually work out a competitive ranking, just like the rugby team, just like the NRL, whatever. And essentially then you go, in that case here, from seaweeds being the weakest competitive to the little grey one to the big one to mussels. So in that case here, and it doesn't really matter, mussels are the most competitive species. Oh, we lost 4 people. Must be really boring. Never mind. So what actually happens here is that if you let a competitive hierarchy running its course, the entire shore should just be dominated by whoever is the competitive most competitive one. And this is actually why mussels are so easy to culture, because essentially they crowd out everybody else. You just have to, hang a few ropes in the water, seed them with the little ones, and off they go. But by and large, and isn't that a nice picture? I just took that basically 2 months ago in California, in the middle of their winter, and it was like 20 degrees. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's almost like the Sunshine Coast. But why I actually took this is we got a little bit of actually, seagrass in here, and we got algae, and we got sea anemones, and we got a few mussels here, and we got all sorts of things. So actually, rocky shores are quite biodiverse, and they're not all mussels, basically. Only mussels dominated by a singular species. Otherwise, you wouldn't actually have to buy a book to actually figure out what actually grows there. They're actually quite diverse. And this is one of the most famous rocky shores, and I was particularly delighted when we actually went there. Look at this nice geological upliftment here. This is why you actually get lots of oil offshore in California, because it all folded like this. And this is also why you basically get really terrible earthquakes every now and then Hollywood goes up in flames and that kind of stuff, because it's geologically extremely basically diverse. And the rocks literally come up as the folds out of the earth in between boulder beaches and some sandy beaches here. Really quite fascinating. And if you actually go this, what you actually see is, firstly, you get horizontal waterfalls, and you go like, whoa, there's actually a lot of mussels, like a lot. But again, look at them. They've got very, very sharp boundaries. The boundaries are so sharp that, again, remember like the barnacles, you might go like, this is very odd, because a mussel really likes to be covered in water all the time. This is really a marginal habitat because they're filter feeders, so they want to suck in water all the time. So what you really, really want is basically be covered by water all the time, and hence you should actually go right all the way down. And look at this. Hey, very sharp boundary. They should actually grow. This is actually going down towards the sea, and this time this is actually at low tide. Now, look at this thing here, and those mussels are actually quite big ones, so about this size. So the starfish, they're the size of dinner plates, and they literally have those colors. I kid you not, it's fantastic. And to give you an idea, a starfish amongst the mussel bed, this is actually the key to setting the species boundaries. Now, this guy here was one of the most influential biologists, for several decades. His name is Robert Payne, Bob Payne, and some people said he was a right royal Payne. And here is his favorite animal, or his unfavorite animal, which is that particular starfish. And he actually stands here in a gigantic tide pool full of those black mussels. And he did one of the most simplest experiments ever. He went to that tide pool for an entire 2 years, or 3 or 4 years, every day in the morning before going to university, searched for starfish and, hurled them back out to sea. They didn't die, they just went somewhere else. So essentially, it was a gigantic starfish removal experiment. And of course, that is the paper which actually came out, Food Complexity and Species Diversity. And it already gives you a clue to what that removal experiment did. Because essentially, if you go from the high tide level here to the low tide level here, mussels are sitting in the middle. They stop at the bottom, which is really weird, as I have explained, because the ones here, because they should really go all the way down into the subtidal. And yet, they're really weird creatures. They have these sharp boundaries, and then the algae, start. So essentially, the shore should be full of competitive, black mussels, but they're not. We got a boundary. So essentially, they should go all the way down, as I've explained, but they don't. So if you basically, it was 5 years actually, remove every single starfish, what you actually get is, essentially, you keep a control area, and you remove them all, and lo and behold, here you actually see one of the guys, I love this photo, eating a mussel, actually prying it open. And then how starfish actually eat that prey? They invert their stomachs like, I'm not going to do it, don't worry about it. And essentially, they invert their stomachs and then eat their prey that way, and then suck it all back in. And what actually happened is, look at this. Basically, the mussels expanded downshore by about 1 meter. And that was truly, truly remarkable, because it went extremely quickly. So essentially, what you actually have is that the mussels outcompeted everything, and you basically land up with a very low diversity community. And that actually gave rise to a weird concept, and that is, the more predation you have, the higher diverse, the more biodiverse, the more species you have in your community. Now, the New Zealanders, of course, you got all the New Zealand sheep jokes, and I'm not going to tell it a sheep joke, but they actually got a little bit of a sense of, I think, humor themselves, because essentially, here we go, on the New Zealand magazine, there was Air New Zealand a few years ago, and I actually grabbed that, from my seat. They actually have sheep in it. So essentially, and of course, this is sort of a New Zealander being defeated by Australians, but never mind. One thing we always have to sort of be conscious about in ecology is that whatever we come up with in terms of new theories or findings, they should actually be applicable somewhere else. Now, nowadays, of course, the only thing which is interested, which society is interested in, is the development of a new vaccine for the coronavirus. However, basically, the same principle applies. You cannot actually have a vaccine which basically only works for Australians and doesn't actually work for Americans or people in South America or wherever. It has to have general validity. So in ecology, it's of course very, very simple, very difficult, I should say, to get actually basically general models, but you apply the same principle as you do in biomedical science, and that is essentially you repeat the same experiment with a different group of subjects. And essentially what people did, they went to New Zealand, and this is a starfish down in the South Island of New Zealand called Schlacher, and they repeated the experiment down there, and pretty much, look, I'm in the middle between two starfish, isn't that nice? And they repeated the same experiment, and what we actually had, that if you have starfish present in both systems, you get about double as many species on a rocky shore. So you might say, oh, this is actually great. We can all go home now. We have discovered something quite amazing, which we didn't actually think beforehand, that predators in a natural system where you have basically, this is also quite funny, you get the terrible book of insults, and one of them was actually about New Zealand, terrible tragedy in the South Seas, 3 million people trapped alive. And before you accuse me of being, kind of mean to the Kiwis, that's actually printed in big letters in the departure hall of Wellington Airport. So essentially, how this basically goes is we have different species on the shore, and they, in essence, predators, they disrupt the competitive hierarchy from running its due course. So predators, in a sense, allow weaker competitors, as counterintuitive as it might actually appear, to exist. And that actually has been then taken up very, very widely throughout the world and in different systems as an organizing principle of ecology. Right. So the question then is, does this always work? Oh, this is interesting. It works if basically people wouldn't actually be looking forever to basically refine theories, and this is something you should actually do. But when you actually think about it, and we go back here, you look at a mussel bed like this, you can actually see there's lots of space in between. There's even organisms growing on top of the mussels. There's some of them growing underneath them. So what we actually have is the mussels itself create a new form of habitat. Yes, macroscopically speaking, when you actually look at the shore now, you go like, oh, mussel, 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 mussel. So there's lower diversity. But at a different scale then, we actually created something new. So what people then actually said, and this is kind of quite interesting, is that a guy called Tom Suchanek, he's now a professor of ecology at the University of California in Davis, he basically said, oh, if I actually take a square meter of mussel bed and I count every single species which actually sits not only on the mussels but also in between, I actually land up with about 100 different ones. And there's only about 25 or 20 in the big one. So it actually depends pretty much on how closely you look. And this is something we refer to in ecology as the spatial scale of investigation. Well, the Germans are good for many things, maybe not for their sense of humor, I'm kidding. But they basically, of course, couldn't actually let the Americans, have the upper hand here. And I said, no, we do it actually much better. And actually applied the principle of generality. So they went to different places like Germany, South Korea, Australia, and basically Chile. And by and large, the same patterns, developed. They found that when you have either on a rocky shore or in sedimentary shores where you have those mussel beds, what they basically do, they create a unique new form of habitat. So again, generality is that, yes, we do find more species when predators are operating in terms of disrupting the competitive dominance, but it also depends on the scale, because if we actually have a species which we call now an ecosystem engineer, like a habitat engineer, which makes something new, then that effect is actually reversed. So here's a second concept, which is basically the one of the ecosystem engineer coming out of those kind of studies. Right, there was part number 2. Has anybody got any questions on the second one before we actually jump into part 3? Everybody cool? Nobody's. The good thing is actually, since you have your video turned off, I can't actually see who's actually asking the question. So you can actually ask anything. Go ahead. Everybody's completely happy. What? Did I hear something?
I just said yes, I'm completely happy.
Absolutely happy, huh? Okay, great. Good. So we go back. Boom, boom, boom. Now, I don't really mind, whether you think I'm completely nuts. We are in a marine ecology lecture, and you might say, what's going on here? I'm seeing elephants. Anybody got an idea why I'm showing you a picture of a big kind of 6-ton animal with a big kind of elongated nose in a rocky shore lecture? Wild guess. You can have a wild guess. No? Nothing?
Do they hunt for the water?
Nope. But it was a good one.
Keystone species are very big and important.
Pardon? Can you speak up a little bit? I didn't hear that.
Sorry, keystone species are very big and important, like the elephant.
Well, it's...
I wouldn't say they're big, maybe. I just think they're species that are vital towards an ecosystem. And if those species were to leave, then they would break down. So maybe that's a species that the elephant would be.
Right. I think we are very, very closely approaching what I actually wanted to illustrate here, is because if you ever have a chance, and I think everybody should really go to Africa once. I mean, it literally takes your breath away. I worked, for a little while in Botswana as a game guide, and when you actually see those big animals going, through the African bush, and you actually see them feeding, very quickly why they are considered a keystone species, because the action of their feeding completely transforms the forest. If you don't actually have elephants, everything gets very quickly, grown together in a very thick, impenetrable thicket. However, the elephants, they might actually look like being raised from feeders, but essentially their feeding actions, by often plugging just one branch off a tree and then ripping the whole tree down, creates that what we actually now see as this sort of open savanna environment. So it is, as somebody said, the action of a particular species which transforms, which engineers the habitats for other ones. So you take that particular species out of the work, so to speak, and there is a much larger influence on the ecology than what you would actually expect by just measuring its biomass. So its behavior and how they interact with the habitat. Now, when you go, and this is a screenshot I took last week, and if you actually just Google keystone species, you get actually, you get a starfish, you get a beaver here, you get an otter, you get a jaguar, you get an otter again, a sea otter, you get a shark. We get wolves, which actually, jump up and down. What was that? Different ones. Herons, shark again. We got a trout or a salmon. Here we got a sampler again. So the concept is a fairly broad one. But let's sort of track a little bit back to where it actually comes from. If you actually then go more scientifically and you search for the term keystone species, it actually Scopus kicks up about 2,500 papers. So it's not something which is not widely used by ecologists. Quite the opposite. It's actually widely used, and it is actually still very much in use today. Now, before we actually go to the keystone species concept, let's just explain what a keystone is. when you build an arch, essentially how it actually works is the stones, they arch, well, they bend towards each other, and then the theory goes, the very last stone which is inserted in the middle, all the lateral forces basically, have their force vectors on there. So that one, that keystone here, that last stone in the middle here, holds essentially the arch together. And it seems, so if you take the keystone out, everything crumbles. And it seems to work actually quite well, because the Romans have used this, for many centuries. And if you go to Rome or to southern France, where you see this, or in Spain, where you see these massive aqueducts crossing river valleys, when the Romans built this, pipelines to cart fresh water or to pipe fresh water from the Alps or from the Pyrenees to the garrison towns. And 2,000 years later, they still stand perfectly, and they're all built on this sort of keystone principle. So the arch and the keystone is a very, very, well-used principle, which actually works quite well. And here, of course, you can actually watch this, video of the otter. Now, why have the otters become, such a, oops. Interesting. Okay, right. Why have the otters, here it goes, become such an emblematic animal for
Off our coast, there are magical underwater forests that the UK emits per year. What that's doing is reduce.
So you can watch this in your own time. It's all about basically, because essentially you can have two quite different, what we call now regime states in a kelp forest. It can be like this, and you see lots of urchins and very few kelps, or it can be like that, where you have this 10-meter high algae growing literally as a swaying underwater forest. And I urge everybody, if you ever have the chance to go diving in a kelp forest, do it. It's just absolutely magnificent. It's something, which is not easily replicated in any other environment. And I actually say it's probably more spectacular than going on a coral reef, but I didn't really say that. In any case, and then it can actually go to that. Lots of urchins and no kelps. So the whole secret really of having a kelp forest or an urchin barren is having the sea otter in place. And so the sea otter has basically been labeled a keystone species because it eats basically the urchins. And if you don't basically have the sea otters in place, the urchins take over and they eat all the little algae, which then don't have a chance to grow into kelp forests anymore. So, and we know that essentially sea otters are extremely important from rocky shores, from a very, very, kind of mean experiment. And it was an experiment done by the fur traders. Now, a sea otter has the world's most dense coat of any animal. I think, I forgot it, but I think it's like 10,000 hairs per square inch or whatever. So essentially, if you want to make, a coat or boots which are absolutely watertight, there's hardly anything better to use than a sea otter fur. And when we are young, basically in Austrian Alps, the coolest thing you could actually have were, sea otter boots, and they were absolutely watertight and warm. And of course, the Eskimos used them and blah blah blah. However, with the commercial, basically fur hunting and the widespread use of firearms, they were literally shot out from much of the American West Coast. And then people said, oh, the kelps basically disappeared as well. And essentially the fisheries went downhill as well. So from that, we learned that by conserving otter populations, we got the kelp forests back. And yet, when you actually go to some of those places, yes, you can see a few basically otters, but their biomass is nowhere near proportional, just the elephants really. I mean, elephants are big, but they're actually quite widely spread out. There's more beetles, there's more termites, there's more earthworms per square meter of savanna in terms of biomass than an elephant. And the same with the sea otters, but yet they're disproportionately important. And pretty much the same goes with the sea stars, the pisaster, which I actually have shown you. It's really where you have one species which sets the community structure for the rest of the community. So we have good experimental evidence. We have to be careful though. The really, really difficult thing though is we can manipulate starfish. We have manipulated, unfortunately, elephants and sea otters, but for many other species, it's very, very hard to do. Where we have done it also, unfortunately, is essentially with sharks, and I will talk about that in about 2 weeks' time, when we talk about the ecosystem consequences that removal of sharks has for the environment. Right, so it's a very useful concept, but we need to be careful that we actually understand the mechanism. I just wanted to actually spend some time on it because it comes from Rocky Shores and we actually use it quite widely now. Right, here we go, and the elephants, eating, the branches, and you can actually see quite often when you go to the savannah, you picture this elephant actually, and they extend, their trunk to about here. And this is basically why you have these acacia trees looking like that, because there is no branches, which are in the elephant's reach. This is how strongly they structure their environment. And this is actually quite, fascinating, really. You can actually work out the elephant density per square meter, and that is actually from a private game reserve where, basically the elephants have increased, over time. So you might say this is actually a good thing. But what you actually get as the elephants, 2 or 3 elephants per square kilometers, that's a lot of elephants on average. And you can actually see, whoop, the trees go down, the stems per tree go down. But what you actually get is the number of grazing animals, things like zebras and basically buffaloes, goes to the roof because you actually create more grassland. So essentially, you can actually promote hippos, rhinos, and buffalo by having more elephants, only because the elephants literally transform a woodland into a savanna. And if you're a giraffe lover, essentially elephants are not as good because essentially giraffes, graze on tall trees, which the elephants often push over. So essentially, giraffes go down, hippos go up, hippos are those, rhinos go up, and buffalo. So it's a really, really cool example, I think, of one particular species transforming the entire habitat. Right. Last but not least, anybody got an idea what that weird-looking creature could be? I'll give you an idea. The front is here, and those are the eyes. Anybody? It's not a simple one. We have a little bit of a clue. We got legs here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it got 10 legs. It got gills, and it got a basically body here. It got stalked eyes, and it got antennae. So this is the larvae, believe it or not, of a lobster. So next time you find yourself on a cruise ship, eating a lobster for dinner, because I think cruises will be really cheap next year, if you want to go on one. You should, of course, never go on a cruise, because do you actually know that 1/3 of all transport-related carbon emissions are emitted by cruise ships? Because big ships, anybody can do whatever they want, because they're all registered in countries, which basically are interested more in sort of, how would I say, getting the registration fees rather than environmental regulation. So this is the larvae of a lobster. And I'll show you that because essentially we have so far talked about the benthic community, things stuck on a rock. However, all animals who live on a rocky shore, and we'll talk about the plankton in the next lecture, are essentially, they need to disperse, they need to reproduce, and they need to actually try and find somewhere else to live. So what they basically, do is they release larvae into the plankton. The plankton are small, little animals which drift around the ocean. Okay, hang on. Now, those, planktonic larvae then, essentially, they grow for a few weeks sometimes, up to months really. They get transported by currents, by tides in offshore waters. Come on. And then essentially, once they have completed their larval development, they say, ooh, I'm a barnacle larvae. I should really be living on a rocky shore. So essentially what they do then is they have to re-invade the shore. Having done that, they essentially produce new juvenile animals which, form part of the community again. Seems like a perfectly nice and simple life cycle. However, here we go. Does this actually work? Yeah. Look at this starfish larvae swimming around. Isn't that absolutely fascinating? And I have to say, it doesn't really look like much, but I did my undergraduate degree in genetics, molecular biology, that kind of stuff. And we had to take a course in embryology. And that was the first marine animal I saw as a student in second year, a molecular biology student. And then you right there and then, this is what I'm going to do, because it was just so intensely beautiful. Here is, the larvae of a barnacle. We have seen the barnacles, of course. They are the ones in the mid-intertidal zone. Oops, off it goes. And it's just two antennae and one pair of legs. But basically, it grows through 4 different stages and essentially, becomes about, 2 millimeters large, and then, butt itself on the rock and become one of those armor-plated inverse shrimp. What else do we have here? Hang on. Off it goes. Here we go. This is the larvae of a snail, and they have this, what I call a veliger. A velum is, of course, like a cape. Think about Dracula. I used to have 3 girls, and I had a Dracula costume. It was the best thing ever in the house, for years. Anyways, and you have a big cape, and you go around like ah, you go ah, and essentially they have the big cape here with lots of hairs where they basically swim around. Here we got the starfish ones, which I already showed you. Those are sea anemone ones, and so forth. So really, really beautiful. And we talk about plankton and larvae a little bit more next week or the week after. Now, once you actually come to think about it, what we usually actually study in the benthic community is the end product of very, very complicated processes where lots of things can actually go wrong or influence how many young ones you get coming into the community. For instance, you can only produce, planktonic larvae if you grow to a ripe old age and reproduce, right? How many you actually produce depends on how much food you have. It depends on your, this is so weird, look, this eye gives me a, it's kind of funny. Depends on, basically how many you can actually produce, how well you are physiologically, in, oops, just a little bit down. Then, when you actually a larvae and you actually get transported out in this environment, you have to be quite careful that essentially you don't get swept, off to New Caledonia. It also depends that you have to have the right water temperature, you have to have the right food, and so forth. So things die out there. Then essentially, when it actually comes to re-invading the shore, often you only got a few days, and that is between your last larval stage and when you basically have to find a shore to metamorphose. And that basically means, if you are sitting 500 kilometers offshore, it's game over. It also means that the predators of those larvae, particularly fish, they lie in wait for things to come actually in. So you actually have to run the gauntlet of fish predation to actually make it to the rocky shore. So essentially, once you have done that, you still have all those adults on the shore which don't actually want you to live there, right? So they try to undercut you. Remember that example I showed you of this barnacles, just when you get a nail out of a plank and they will go off into space. So I actually made this up here. So you can actually say that the more larvae you actually get on the shore in terms of waves coming in, the more intense your biological interactions will be. But it also means is the more larvae you get, the fewer or the less important what I call here stochastic events are. So essentially, it might not actually matter that much if you have storms or a heat wave or ice shear or a very, very, strong rainfall event, which actually, makes everything, less marine, so to speak, on the shore, because there's enough young to actually replace the ones which are dying. So it's a delicate balance, really, where you say, ooh, do I actually have millions of recruits coming in? That actually sets everybody up for a really, really dense struggle of competition and predation on the shore. Or do you actually basically say, ooh, that is actually a good thing because I don't actually have to worry too much about stochastic environmental effects. So essentially, this is something where we basically said, normally, stuck to a rock for life, yes, but this is only the end outcome of a long, complicated process. So, and sometimes larval settlement choice is a really, really important one. I mean, look at this barnacle. You might say, hey, it might not have had the best choice in terms of a stable substrate, but then again, it's going to see the world and not much competition, and it's always passed in water, and it actually goes through, very, very nice patches of food. I don't quite know what the turtle thinks about it, but turtles have the, the brain of the size of a hazelnut. So it probably is not very, very nice, but not much you can actually do about it. So what this actually basically tells us is, though, there's a big shift in our thinking that, yes, we study rocky shores, but it actually is not very meaningful if you don't actually understand the larval biology of those species and the factors which actually make this thing go around. And this is a very, very nice, I think, segue, because in the next lecture, we are going to actually chat about plankton and how it actually basically almost in terms of biological productivity. Dispersal and reproduction ties many of the marine ecosystems which we actually encounter together. Right, and I'm nearly out of my voice, so it's actually over to you for questions.